When you were like a little kid, did you ever think your dad should be the president?
My dad's listening to this. Yes, absolutely.
I hope my dad's listening. Dad, if you're listening, send me a text right now saying that you're listening, because this is heavy competition between you and Arthur's dad. And this is the presidential election.
Yeah, so Dad, send me a text right away.
Which of you will become president is dependent on who gets that text.
Welcome to A Century in Cinema. I'm Arthur.
And I'm Andrew.
And this is a podcast where we discuss a classic film from every year. Today's film is from 1939, Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. You can always check our show notes to find out exactly where it's streaming these days, no matter when you're listening. I myself watched it on IMDb TV. I didn't even know this was a thing. But it's almost like watching it on television. There are ads in the middle of it, and that's kind of unfortunate. But I did watch it for free, so that's kind of nice.
I think I rented it through Amazon. I saw that, and actually I think on Amazon they had an IMDb TV option, and they're like, you can watch it for free with ads. And I just didn't want to do that, man.
I don't blame you. I mean, it's not the right experience, is it?
No, I don't know. What's the right experience?
As the filmmakers intended, being interrupted by bleach commercials. So this is 1939.
Yep.
Technically the very first year of the Second World War.
Yep.
So welcome everyone to the Second World War.
We're here.
In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union attacked Poland, and Britain, France, India, Australia, and New Zealand declared war on Germany. That's all happening in September, and the United States decides to remain neutral during all of it. But FDR does begin rearming the country for war, and that stimulates an economic revival, which helps to end the Great Depression. Also, this year, Albert Einstein speaks to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, initiating the Manhattan Project, America's atomic bomb program. And that is happening in secret, of course. So yeah, World War II starting this year. That's the big event. All these countries declaring war on each other. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that conflict was happening throughout the 30s. There was Japan invading Manchuria. There was Italy invading Ethiopia. The Spanish Civil War. That all seems like it's part of the same conflict, but the amount of countries that start declaring war on each other this year really does mark the beginning of the Second World War. But there was hundreds of thousands of people being killed in Asia leading up to this.
Right.
All sorts of other little conflicts around the world that can really be seen as part of the same ideological battle that we kind of think of in World War II, democracy versus fascism and that kind of thing. Obviously, a lot of these history lessons, our entire view of the world is framed from an American perspective. I think for a lot of Americans, World War II doesn't even begin until Pearl Harbor, right? But that's still 2 years away. It happens at the end of 1941. It's not even really until 1942 that America is involved.
Yeah.
There's so much going on in these coming years. It's so hard to really talk about anything. But that's not really film related, is it? You mentioned that 1939 is a great year in film history. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Oh, yeah. 1939 is considered the golden year of Hollywood cinema. I mean, even today, it's considered one of the greatest years in Hollywood cinema. There were 10 nominees for Best Picture this year. And just in general, this is considered a year where many, many great films were released. It could be people were feeling this impending huge war coming down. It could be, at this point, we're 10 years out from talkies becoming kind of a norm, and people are starting to revolutionize in other areas of filmmaking and editing and, using color. But of course, the big two-hitter this year, one of the great American epics, Gone with the Wind, as well as the most successful MGM musical of a humongous era of musicals, The Wizard of Oz, is released this year. A phenomenal adaptation of Wuthering Heights is released this year, as well as Of Mice and Men. Outside of America, Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game is released this year. One of the greatest comedy of errors and that's ever been released. It's really funny. It's really sad. Oh, and our girl Marlene Dietrich, one of her finest performances, Destry Rides Again, an absolutely hilarious Western, was released this year, also starring James Stewart. And the two of them are an incredible pair in that film. Marcel Carnes' Le Jour se lève is released this year, which would be a huge foundation for the films he would go on to make and be famous for, including Les Visiteurs du Soir a few years later and Children of Paradise, his masterpiece in 1945. This was just a really huge year for film. A lot of groundbreaking films came out, and our film is a part of that legacy. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, one of the highest grossing films of the year. It ushered in the reign of James Stewart as an actor. It cemented Frank Capra as one of the great film directors of his time. So yeah, it's just considered a really important year in film history just because so many huge... It's just like the peak of this system we've been talking about, you know, this Hollywood system where these actors are kind of owned by studios and they're all doing these, you know, weird situations of having their projects and everyone's like locked away in these studios for months on end and making these movies. You know, this era that doesn't really exist in Hollywood anymore, this is truly considered the peak of that era. And on top of all of that, of course, so much of Hollywood and so much of the studio system would go towards making propaganda films. And, you know, the war would take away to a certain extent some of the budget and some of the resources, you know, actors, directors going off to fight in the war. So it not only was this peak, but also was sort of just the end of, you know, an era of flourishing within the current system before, you know, the entire world was raged by war.
I think that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was number 2 at the box office this year, right behind Gone with the Wind, of course.
Of course.
But it was also number 3 top box office for the entire decade. Like, this was an incredibly popular film, more popular than most of the films that we've been watching by a long shot.
Yeah.
Just based on the amount of money it took in.
Absolutely.
Before we get into trivia and discussion about the film, do you want to sort of summarize it for us?
I'm trying to keep these more concise because now that I listen to the episodes, I'll listen to plot synopsis sometimes and I'm like, no one even knows what the movie was about after all that, I guess. Yeah, so James Stewart plays Jefferson Smith, who is a man who is brought on as a senator. He is seen by this political machine as somebody who won't ruffle too many feathers because he seems a little simple, but also is charismatic and nice enough that people will see him as a strong choice. They plan on using him as a puppet. He gets to the United States Senate, tries to pass a bill to reserve land for a Boy Scout camp, although it's not called the Boy Scouts within the film.
Right.
And it turns out the land he wants to use is land that is underneath a very sketchy policy from the same political machine that brought him on. So they try to bulldoze him and accuse him of fraud and ruin his reputation and career. And so he goes on a 26-hour filibuster in the United States Senate to clear his name and to oust this political machine. And it more or less works. Oh, and there's a romance. His secretary, Jean Arthur, is romantically involved with him.
And that romance, his secretary is supposed to be us, right? Going from this cynical take on the system, maybe, to being won over by Jefferson Smith and his ideology in the end.
Maybe in 2020 I could see that, but I think the film's text is trying to make us be Jefferson Smith. I think Saunders, the secretary, I think she's supposed to be like the super knowledgeable one who's, you know, been deeply entrenched in U.S. politics. I think at this time, anyways, people were probably way more optimistic about the American government than she is.
Yeah, that might be true. I mean, it is just interesting that this film was so popular. It must have struck a real chord with the general public, and its ideology clearly did resonate with everyone. And you're right. I think that is Jefferson Smith and his sort of Boy Scout mentality.
And you know, just the way he's so verklempt with everything happening in Washington. He can't get enough of the Capitol. He wants to go up to Mount Vernon before his first day at the Senate. He sees everything as so sentimental and so patriotic.
He does all the tourist stuff first before he goes and actually does the job.
Right. And I think that's how a lot of Americans probably felt around this time. Of course, I mean, I'm sure there were always critics, but something that I thought was so interesting, there's this great late night interview with Frank Capra on David Letterman, and he talked about how journalists who went to the early Washington premiere, which we'll discuss a little bit more later, were appalled at it. And it wasn't because of its stance on politics. It was because they were intimidated that a movie could possibly have more journalistic integrity and get more information to people than journalism itself.
I mean, yeah, I felt like I learned quite a bit about Senate procedures and, you know, how a bill becomes a law, what a filibuster even looks like in this film. Yeah, so for someone who's not familiar with even just what the inside of the Senate chambers looks like, this film does a great job of putting you there and really entrenching you in it. It's kind of cool.
Well, what did you think of this film?
I don't know. I feel like no matter what, you're going to view this film and its ideology through your own prism. Mm-hmm. It's so hard not to. And sort of your own views of politics and Washington. It's all going to get distorted by just even like the week you watch this in, maybe. So it's hard to escape from that. The film itself is incredibly done. I think that it's well written and entertaining and catches your attention. And like you said, it educates you about American political procedure, which is I think that's a good thing. And especially the filibuster at the end is so well done and just crescendos into this fantastic climax when he's digging through all of those correspondence from the people back in his state telling him to just give up, and he still doesn't. I mean, there's nobility there. You're on this guy's side. You're on the movie's side.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly optimistic.
Yeah.
To a naive degree, maybe. But I know this was a different time, and I know that Frank Capra himself is bringing his own history into this. So, yeah, you know, the film's well done.
I really enjoyed this film. I would agree. That was my number one takeaway as far as criticisms. I was thinking, well, that was a very optimistic view. The corrupt senator learned the error of his ways, and now there's no more corruption in the government. But I found Jean Arthur so funny and charming in this film, and she really was sort of my hook into the whole thing.
Maybe that's why I identified with her too, saw myself in her.
What I meant earlier was that I think Jefferson is supposed to be that everyman that people can sort of place themselves into.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's what the intention is. But I mean, yeah, I also saw more of myself in her character. And yeah, the scene where she just gets mind-numbingly drunk, and she played that so well, and that was so comical and a little heartbreaking. Yeah, I just thought in general the chemistry between all of the characters, all of the actors was really, really well done. And I don't think we'll get another chance to discuss him. And we didn't really discuss him in the Robin Hood episode. Claude Rains as Senator Payne is so amazing in this film. And he played Prince John in Robin Hood last week. And of course, his most famous performance is Captain Louis Rinal in Casablanca, which is an absolutely mesmerizing, layered performance from him. He was one of the great character actors of his time, and this is truly a standout performance in his career, especially the final sequence, which he attempts suicide. Really shocked by that moment, and just in general thought he was incredible in this film.
Yeah, I absolutely loved him. And I thought his character had so many layers and went through an amazing arc. I really enjoyed that Senator Payne character. He plays him so well.
But yeah, overall, I was really entertained by the film. I would agree. I thought it was very well made, really sharp editing, and a really fun musical score as well. It definitely felt like a piece with a perspective. I mean, regardless of how optimistic it might be near the end, it definitely has a mildly cynical view of American politics and American government.
I mean, cynical enough that it scared the censors initially.
Yeah, they were really terrified of the source material as well as the original screenplay for it when they were first pitching it around. And so I think that's interesting. It's also interesting you watch this and you think this is what was considered politically controversial at the time.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, if someone were to remake this movie today, it would not be funny.
No, there would be no comedy involved, no.
It would be a very, very sad story about some poor guy who just gets eaten up and spat back out. Because, I don't think him rising to power and him being able to win against this political machine feels realistic in 2021. Oh my gosh, that's right. So when the story was originally published, it had to go through the Hays Code, and they discouraged it being made. They objected to the generally unflattering portrayal of our system of government, which might well lead to such a picture being considered both here and more particularly abroad as a covert attack on the democratic form of government. The Senate is made up of a group of fine, upstanding citizens who labor long and tirelessly for the best interests of the nation, is the Hays Code perspective and what we should be thinking. That same interview with David Letterman, Frank Capra mentions this as well. He mentions that people were thinking if the Germans watched this, specifically the Germans, they would see weakness in the American government. And it's just, I mean,
yeah, I mean, the middle part of this film, yeah, there's corruption in the Senate, and there's the people strong arming, and there's the relationships over any sort of ideology. All of that's there. I don't think any of it's unrealistic, but I can see how the Hays office was thinking that might be taken advantage of. I know eventually the Hays office did come around and say that this is actually a great demonstration of the democratic process, and they actually sort of endorsed the film when it was being released.
Yes.
And nothing changed. It's not like the producers took any of their advice. It's just they decided to be in a better mood that week. I don't know.
Yeah, thank God they did, because if they hadn't, we probably wouldn't be talking about it right now.
It'd be a bad, boring movie.
Oh, I was talking about the Hays Code letting it be released.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that too.
Also, if
You're
they
right.
had taken any of the advice of the Hays office.
You know, both of those scenarios would not have gotten us the movie we have now. So
yeah.
That's so funny.
Not only was this film really popular in America with American audiences, but it was also really popular overseas. I mean, the Hays office was afraid of it portraying democracy in some sort of negative light. Maybe it does for some of the film, but in the end, I mean, it wins out. When France was occupied by the Nazis and all of these foreign films were scheduled to get banned, audiences demanded that this film play in theaters just basically nonstop. This was one of the films that was just playing before the Nazis put in a curfew on all of these foreign films. It's got a very uplifting, hopeful message. I can see why the people of France might have needed that at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I got teary-eyed when the little Boy Scout, who's not a Boy Scout, runs up to him on the Senate floor when he's given his filibuster and shows that he's put the little pin back on.
The badge back on. Yeah.
I cried. I
love that.
It's a good moment. And the Boy Scouts ripped off their badges in shame earlier in the film, right?
Now, what are they called in this? The Boy Scouts of America would not let them use their name.
I know, and they're just so clearly Boy Scouts that I keep calling them that.
It's literally the Boy Scouts. Boy Rangers. That's right.
Okay.
It's the Boy Rangers. That's how he says it. When Frank Capra was first going to take on this project, he kind of saw it as a potential sequel to Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, which is why the titles are so similar. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town stars Gary Cooper and Jean Arthur, and it was going to be a Gary Cooper vehicle with a different leading lady. But then Gary Cooper was unable to do it, and Frank Capra still had it in his head that he wanted this to somehow be connected. So instead, he thought Jean Arthur will be perfect for the secretary, and her and James Stewart had actually already played romantic leads in another film that he won Best Picture and Best Director for, You Can't Take It With You, a very funny film. So James Stewart was kind of an up-and-coming actor at this point. He wasn't super well-known. This role was a huge moment in his career. Yeah, and it went through a lot of script changes, a lot of casting changes. It initially premiered in Washington in front of a group of politicians, including senators and the journalists I mentioned earlier as well. And they all hated it. And I say they all. That's the reputation. This screening has a very infamous reputation of being sort of a flop with people who worked for Washington. So the main takeaway was that the politicians felt very threatened by their portrayal in this film. And, if you see something like this and you see yourself in it and you feel threatened by it, then that means it's probably doing a good job portraying you. Yeah, it's a very hopeful film.
Frank Capra's career as a filmmaker was utilized by the United States government during the war. Did you read anything about the propaganda films that he directed?
Oh, what are they all called? It's like Our Country at War or something.
Why We Fight series.
Why We Fight, right. They're all on YouTube.
Yeah, they're all free. They were commissioned by the United States federal government in order to educate the incoming troops about, why we fight.
Which we watched all of in preparation for this podcast and will now be discussing in detail.
No, just a tiny tidbit. In Prelude to War, they do mention that 1931 is the start date of the war we are currently fighting. September, specifically when Japan invades Manchuria. That film specifically mentions that is the start of the war we are fighting.
Fascinating.
Which I found interesting.
Yeah.
But those films come out in 1942 and throughout the war. And they're really more like documentaries, right? They're using a lot of archival footage. Frank Capra uses a lot of footage from Triumph of the Will and other propaganda films from the enemy archives.
So you did watch the first one then?
Yeah. He's a dramatic filmmaker and working in Hollywood, and I know these are propaganda films. It is like a pretty different genre, but you could still see echoes of it. You could still see the montage of all the landmarks and stuff. You could almost see someone in the State Department being like, oh yeah, I saw this Mr. Smith Goes to Washington thing, and that scene at the National Mall, really, that's the kind of thing we need the American public to see.
What's fascinating to me, he's making all of those movies. He is a major in the war itself, and somehow in the middle of all of this also directs Arsenic and Old Lace.
Huh.
I don't know. It just seems like a really crazy time in his life. Yeah, it's interesting because he wasn't even drafted. He wanted to join the service. He was a very patriotic person.
Right, and that's another reason why I say when you think of this film and its ideology, you have to see it from Frank Capra's point of view, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
He is an immigrant. He's from Italy originally, but he was...
Sicily, but,
Yeah, sorry. I know some Italians would actually be very angry that I didn't specify that. So Sicily, yeah. But he grows up in L.A. from a young age. And he has sort of a classic rags to riches story. He gets very, very lucky as he kind of falls into the film industry and actually lies his way in. I find it so funny how many people just lie their way into the film industry at this time. Like people make calls to producers and they just lie and they get jobs and stuff. Like that's funny.
Yeah, he was one of the gag men on some early silent films, and one of the physical comedians who was kind of front and center, and it's not anyone who we've discussed or that people would really know offhand, but he asked him to direct the film because he liked the gags he would come up with so much.
Mm-hmm. He was under Columbia Pictures, which was a pretty small studio at the time, and they were mainly just doing shorts. They weren't part of the Big Five. But his films really kind of catapult Columbia Pictures, and especially this one. I mean, it's just got to, with the amount of money it pulls in. It really becomes a big studio because of him.
Yeah. I mean, he just sort of took off. He was able to make films in a tight, entertaining way, and was very agreeable with actors. And again, I mean, you watch interviews with him, you watch the way he talks, you can totally see why people felt so comfortable around him and why he had such a good way with people, because he's just a very approachable man.
So how does this film and its legacy fit into the overall legacy of the year 1939?
It was the second highest grossing film of the year. I think that in a year where, at this point, the two most popular films in people's memories in pop culture, one is a lush melodrama about romantic dealings in the South during the Civil War, and the other is a fantasy about a girl who escapes away to an imaginary land. This film sort of stands out as being one that takes place right directly in America and fully criticizes the political processes of it. And I think that's really interesting, because Gone with the Wind at this point, in 2020, receives criticism, and fairly so, of its depictions of Black people and the way it sort of glorifies the old American South.
It's playing on the box office success of The Birth of a Nation. It's even following a lot of the same formulas with, the big epic scope and the fall of the South and that sentimentality for, the old way of life. But it's almost like they learned their lesson, and now they're like, well, we'll just make the racism a little bit more under the surface.
I still think it's a great film, though. That Vivien Leigh performance, I mean, it's a 4.5-hour film about the most unlikable, detestable woman in cinema. But you just love her. Like, I don't know, there's just something about her that is so captivating and so entertaining. And and I'm not even gonna go into all the cinematography and it's just such a lush, beautiful film. And no one has any criticisms for The Wizard of Oz, because there's nothing to criticize.
So I did find one review for this film just to kind of showcase how beloved it was. It's from Variety, and that's linked in the show notes.
I mean, even at the time, people saw it as obviously something a little reserved from the true American political system, because they say here, Capra never attempts to expose political skullduggery on a wide scale within our governmental system. He selects one state political machine, and after displaying its power and ruthlessness, proceeds to tear it to pieces. And, that's clearly sort of a mild jab of them saying, okay, it's not like this is the only problem. It's not like there's just this one conservative state that has this political machine, and that's the only problem.
This review says there's tremendous dramatic impact threaded throughout the picture, interwoven with those deaf human episodes, which have become familiar with Capra's direction in previous pictures. He keys the motivation of his basic premise without wasting time, and then carries it through vigorously. All that is to say that the film is just masterfully constructed.
Yeah.
And even me, kind of cynical at the beginning, by the time the filibuster's happening on screen, like, you're totally invested and you're rooting for this guy.
So I wrote down these points before the events of this week have transpired. Would you like to discuss the events of this week, or do you not want those to be contained in this episode?
I like these podcasts being evergreen, but it is worth noting that we watched this film right around the events of January 6th, 2021, when there was a siege on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So again, it's hard not to see this film from the prism of the time you are living in and your thoughts at that time. How does this film play in 2021? It feels very naive, like I said.
Yeah. There's almost a part of me that feels weird about enjoying it and cheering it on, as it's literally a country bumpkin invades the Senate and takes over the floor. And it's like, yeah, this is something to be celebrated. I know that's not it's not like he stormed at the castle. It's not like he's there when he's not supposed to be. But, that mentality of, you should go in and show the Senate what's what. I don't know. That was something that went through my head yesterday.
I mean, Jeff Smith is an upstanding person.
Yes.
All things considered.
Yeah. So it's so funny. I was just thinking, how do the politics in this movie play in modern times? And I just put that on the points, and then the day before we record, stuff just goes down, and I was like, oh, well, okay, I guess we're gonna talk about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington tomorrow. I would agree. This film plays very naive in modern days.
I mean, also the big conflict is with a political machine, and those sort of big corrupt machines are not a part of the system anymore.
Yeah.
When people think of Frank Capra and they think of It's a Wonderful Life and why they love that kind of film, like, this film is a classic, but it's also not playing on TV. Like, it's not something people really watch and enjoy. It didn't stand the test of time like Frank Capra's other films.
I would say literally just the one. I don't mean that as a criticism at all. I mean, he was huge at the time, and, he got to experience real success and he got to experience real failures. I mean, I think it's kind of poetic that one of the big failures that would kind of lead him down the path of deciding he didn't want to make movies at all anymore is now easily his most famous film. It's a Wonderful Life really still feels more resonant and more relatable in a way. And so maybe that's why it was the one that was able to stand the test of time.
I still need to see It's a Wonderful Life. I'm sure I'll love it when I see it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I have anything else to say about this film.
We're, one episode into World War II.
I mean, you could watch so many World War II films and they all take place in the same cinematic universe. Really, this precludes the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Someone was really onto something when they came up with this World War II thing.
What's the worst movie you've seen about World War II?
Man, I've seen a lot of good ones. I mean, in general, I try to not watch bad films. What's the worst film I've seen about World War II?
I can tell you the worst one I've seen. It's To Hell and Back.
Okay.
Starring Audie Murphy from 1955. Audie Murphy played himself. He was a real soldier.
Oh,
Have I talked to you about this movie before?
Either you have or I just know about it, but this is go ahead.
Yeah, he was in a tank. Pretty much everyone else in his battalion troop, I don't know anything, guys. Everyone else had died, and so it was just him facing off against a German army, and he took them all out with just him in a tank. The movie is dreadful. It's not well made. He literally went insane on the set because it just triggered him so hard, and he was forced to relive take after take his real world experience, which was a very harrowing experience for him. And my favorite aspect of the movie is Inglourious Bastards, which is, in my opinion, Tarantino's masterpiece among many masterpieces. But the film that is in Inglourious Bastards, the German propaganda film of the lone soldier on the top of the tower, that is a direct parody of To Hell and Back. And I mean, because within the film Inglourious Bastards, it's seen as so disgusting that a country would make a movie like that and celebrate it. We see Hitler literally laughing at it in the theater. And it is like one of the sharpest critiques of America in a movie. Because if you know your history, you're like, oh my God, he's literally talking about To Hell and Back and how Americans, even though this is a horrible movie, just ate it up.
I think Pearl Harbor might actually be the worst World War II film I've seen.
You are probably right, man. You think I want to watch Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor attacks, when I could be watching Kate Beckinsale? Are you kidding me? Know your audience. Last Days of Disco didn't turn into Pearl Harbor halfway through. They knew they had better sense.
But actually, I wanted to really quickly, I do want to take a moment to ask you, 1930s, what was your favorite film that we watched?
Oh my gosh, we're here. We made it.
We're done. Yeah.
We're done with the 30s. Congratulations, everyone. We made it. And thank you everyone for being on this journey with us. I know we say it in the posts and stuff, but we like to record it too. Y'all's continued support. Listenership has been growing, and the support has just been really great and overwhelming, and we really appreciate you guys. So
yeah, thank you. Keep commenting on posts. We like talking with you all about these films.
oh, follow our Facebook page. We haven't even really plugged that in the actual podcast yet.
Yeah, we're really bad at this whole like marketing ourselves thing.
Okay, favorite film. Oh my gosh, dude, I'm just looking at bangers right now. I mean, as far as, because you know, a lot of these I had seen before, but as far as films I watched for the first time, Babyface I think might have been my favorite from this decade. It's the only one that I've watched again since we recorded that episode. I thought it was so funny. I thought it was so clever. I thought the lead performance from Barbara Stanwyck was just gorgeous. And then as far as actual favorite movie, including the ones that I'd seen before, I would probably go with The Blue Angel, just because I love von Sternberg and I love that turn into sound from him.
Oh, yeah.
And I think both of those performers, as you know, we discussed, her coming in about to take Hollywood by storm and him sort of being giving like one final great performance at the end of the sound era is a really poetic moment. So yeah, I would say Babyface and The Blue Angel were my two favorites.
Well, like you said, it was a really strong lineup of films that we watched this decade. I have to pick one.
Just pick one.
If I say the awful truth, you'll accuse me of
No.
only choosing it because of Cary Grant.
No, I would never. It was a tough. I think it's a great film.
I do think just that one, it's the most fun film. I think that I'm going to choose that one.
Wow, someone has a real man crush on Cary Grant, but okay.
Okay. We're shutting this off.
Wait, no. I mean, we got to do one final hurrah for things to come. Being what I think.
What was the worst film?
What I think is the worst movie we've watched on the podcast so far. And I kind of knew that going into it as well, because I really didn't like it the first time I watched it. But revisiting it was a really fun experience. And I honestly loved recording that episode with you. That was a fun time.
I thought it was probably one of the most interesting films we dissected. And we really kind of tore it apart, didn't we?
Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating, the time it's coming out in history and what it's trying to predict. And that, yeah, exactly how wrong it is. But yeah, it's a weird one, yeah. For the whole decade, 1930s, do you feel like there was a theme or something you noticed about all of the films that sort of defined the decade? And maybe this is just how I picked the films, but yeah, I just felt like this decade, the films we watched seemed to be more in touch with the current events of the time and how audiences felt about those events. You know, maybe that's because of the Great Depression and world events going on at the time.
I would agree with that. The 20s to me felt more of an establishing of what the medium was and what it was capable of. A lot of films there felt pretty boundary pushing, but I think that was more just really trying to show what film is capable of. In this decade, it feels like the first few films especially feel like they are protesting the imminent censorship headed towards the medium. The Blue Angel, The Public Enemy, and Babyface especially really feel...
This is mainly for the American film industry, but I know exactly what you mean.
But, you know, La Adelante, even though that one's French, it feels so open about its sexuality and its romance. And then to watch the films that came out after the code was imposed, I guess mainly thinking of The Awful Truth, films that are now having to walk the tightrope. But I would agree with what you're saying, too, about how these films definitely seem to want to be more involved in world events. Obviously, we had Battleship Potemkin in the 20s, and there were a few films here and there that really were full reflections of that time period. But in this one, it does feel... It feels like they want the audience to really be able to relate to the film, and it wants the audience to be able to understand the film without given context. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, of course, was completely set in the real world with no real fantastical elements as far as the setup was concerned. And then Robin Hood, full fantasy. It still feels as if it's some sort of escapist drama that is formulated from that time period of
because they're still talking about wealth inequality and taxation and that kind of thing that people in the Depression would really relate to. Yeah, I see that.
The only one that feels fully removed and fantastical is Vampire. I mean, I respect and love all the films in this lineup, but that one is easily the most boundary pushing as far as what film is capable of this lineup.
And of course, when we were talking about that film, we talked about how it feels like a silent film. It felt older than the other films that we were watching at that time, like it was from the previous era. I just kind of thought of this, but do you think it's the new commercial need for films to really make their money back now that sound is such an important part of it? And, expenses are ballooning, all of this kind of thing. Is that why films from this era become way more involved with the expectations of their audiences? You need to sort of appeal to a larger group of people, the masses.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I mean, film is becoming a more commodified art form, and it's becoming the huge industry. But I definitely saw the rise of, Hollywood in this decade.
Yes. All their sound stages and their actors and directors and this whole machine that they've got going on. Yes.
And it really culminated with Robin Hood for me as far as what Hollywood was capable of.
Yeah, I mean, Robin Hood feels like a precursor to something like Star Wars.
Yes.
In its mass appeal and general enjoyability.
Yes.
Well, I think that'll do it for this episode.
The next episode, I am so excited, you guys. We will be doing Dance Girl Dance from 1940, directed by Dorothy Arzner.
Ooh, a woman.
Yes, a gay female director from this era in Hollywood. The only female director in the big Hollywood system at this time. And this is a really phenomenal film. Spoiler alert for the episode next week. And it just got a release through Criterion on Blu-ray a few months ago. And that release just made my heart do a little somersault. You can find where Dance Girl Dance is available to watch in the show notes. And that link is not only good for the week we release it, but will also be good for whenever you are listening to the episode. And we look forward to discussing it and having you guys join us.
I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.